What happens when unconscious bias meets unstoppable consequence? On a humid Thursday evening at George Bush Intercontinental Airport in Houston, Texas, this question would be answered in the most dramatic way possible. Flight UA 1847 to Los Angeles was scheduled for an PM departure, carrying 187 passengers who had no idea they were about to witness an incident that would spark nationwide outrage and forever change airline protocols. The date was March 15, 2024. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of evening departures, business travelers checking emails, families corralling children, and the constant hum of announcements echoing through Gate C28. Among the crowd, one passenger sat quietly in the first-class boarding area, scrolling through his phone with the practiced patience of someone accustomed to frequent travel. Marcus Washington, 52, wasn't just any passenger. As the founder and CEO of Washington Tech Solutions, he had built a billion-dollar empire from a small Houston garage, revolutionizing cybersecurity systems for Fortune 500 companies. His success story was the American dream realized. Yet on this particular evening, his wealth, achievements, and first-class ticket would mean nothing in the face of systemic prejudice. Washington had flown this exact route dozens of times before. United Airlines knew him well. He was a Global Services member, their highest tier of frequent flyer status. His assistant, Jennifer Chen, had booked seat 2A as she always did, knowing Marcus preferred the aisle for his long legs and the ability to work undisturbed during the 5-hour flight to LAX. The first sign of trouble came at PM during pre-boarding. Sarah Mitchell, a gate agent with 3 years of experience, glanced at Marcus as he approached with his boarding pass. Something flickered across her face, a moment of hesitation that would later be dissected in depositions and HR investigations. She scanned his pass and the system beeped approval, but instead of the usual, "Welcome aboard, Mr. Washington," she said nothing and handed back his documents with barely concealed suspicion. Marcus noticed the interaction felt different, but he'd experienced enough microaggressions in his lifetime to know when to pick his battles. He boarded the aircraft, stowed his carry-on in the overhead compartment, and settled into his seat. The cabin was luxurious, leather seats, extra legroom, and attentive service that justified the premium price. He pulled out his MacBook, preparing to review contracts for a merger worth $200 million. Flight attendant Jessica Rodriguez, a 12-year veteran with United, performed her pre-flight safety checks. She'd served Marcus before and always found him to be polite and professional. Tonight, however, she noticed something unusual. 3 passengers in economy were pointing toward first class and whispering among themselves. One of them, David Sullivan, a middle-aged insurance salesman from Dallas, was gesticulating toward Marcus's seat. "Excuse me," Sullivan called out to Jessica as she passed. "I think there's been some mistake. That man up there, are you sure he belongs in first class?" Jessica's training kicked in immediately. She knew the implications of such comments, but company policy required her to investigate any passenger concerns. She approached Sullivan with professional composure, asking what specifically was the issue. "Well, look at him," Sullivan said, lowering his voice but not enough to avoid being overheard by nearby passengers. "Does he really look like he can afford first class? Maybe he's in the wrong seat." The accusation hung in the air like toxic fumes. Other passengers began to take notice, some nodding in agreement, others looking uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Jessica felt her heart rate increase. She'd witnessed discrimination before, but never so blatantly directed at someone she knew to be a legitimate passenger. Meanwhile, Marcus remained absorbed in his work, unaware that his presence had become a topic of debate among strangers who knew nothing about his life, his achievements, or his right to occupy the seat he had purchased. The irony was staggering. A man who had donated millions to educational charities and employed thousands of people was being questioned about his worthiness to sit in an airline seat. The situation escalated when Sullivan decided to involve more authority. He pressed the call button repeatedly, demanding to speak with the captain about what he termed a security concern. His voice carried throughout the cabin, and Marcus finally looked up from his laptop, sensing the tension that had enveloped the aircraft. Captain Robert Hayes, a 25-year veteran pilot with an impeccable safety record, was conducting his final pre-flight checks when Jessica knocked on the cockpit door. Her face was flushed with embarrassment as she explained the situation. Hayes felt a knot form in his stomach. He'd heard about incidents like this from other pilots, but he'd never faced one directly. The captain's decision in the next few minutes would determine whether UA 1847 would take off on schedule or become the center of a national controversy. As he stood in the galley watching Marcus work peacefully in Seat 2A, Hayes grappled with the weight of the moment. Company protocol required him to investigate any security concerns, but his gut told him this was something entirely different. Countdown to disaster had begun, though none of the 187 passengers realized it yet. In just 33 minutes, this routine flight would become anything but routine, and a single moment of prejudice would cascade into consequences that would reverberate far beyond the confines of the aircraft. To understand the magnitude of what was about to unfold, one must first understand Marcus Washington, not as the stranger in Seat 2A, but as the man who had overcome impossible odds to achieve the impossible. Born in Houston's 3rd Ward, one of the city's most economically challenged neighborhoods, Marcus had learned early that success would require not just talent and determination, but the ability to navigate a world that often saw his skin color before his capabilities. His journey began in 1972, in a cramped apartment on Calhoun Street, where his mother, Dorothy Washington, worked 3 jobs to support her 2 children after Marcus's father left when he was 7. Dorothy cleaned offices downtown before dawn, worked at a school cafeteria during the day, and took in laundry in the evenings. Despite the exhaustion that marked her face, she never missed a parent-teacher conference and always found money for Marcus's school supplies, even when it meant skipping meals herself. "Education is your ticket out," Dorothy would tell Marcus, as she helped him with homework at the kitchen table, surrounded by folded laundry and the smell of beans cooking on the stove. "They can take everything from you, but they can't take what's in your head." Marcus excelled academically, graduating valedictorian from Jack Yates High School despite the underfunded conditions and overcrowded classrooms. His guidance counselor, Mrs. Eleanor Jackson, recognized his potential and helped him secure a full scholarship to Rice University, where he would study computer science and electrical engineering. College opened Marcus's eyes to possibilities he had never imagined. While his classmates discussed spring break trips to Europe and summer internships arranged through family connections, Marcus worked at the university's computer lab, learning programming languages and networking systems. He noticed how technology could level playing fields. In cyberspace, ideas mattered more than appearances. His breakthrough came during his junior year when he identified a critical vulnerability in Rice University's network security system. Instead of exploiting it, Marcus documented the flaw and presented a solution to the IT department. Dr. Michael Chen, the computer science department head, was so impressed that he recommended Marcus for an internship at a major Houston-based energy company. "This young man has a gift," Dr. Chen wrote in his recommendation letter. "He doesn't just understand technology, he anticipates its evolution. Companies would be wise to invest in his potential." After graduation, Marcus worked for various tech companies, always saving every penny he could. His colleagues often invited him to expensive happy hours or weekend trips, not understanding that his financial priorities were different. While they enjoyed disposable income, Marcus was supporting his mother and saving for his own business venture. The idea for Washington Tech Solutions came to him in 1999, during the dot-com boom. Marcus realized that as businesses became increasingly dependent on digital systems, they would need sophisticated security measures. He saw an opportunity to specialize in cybersecurity for large corporations, particularly in Houston's energy sector. Starting the company required every dollar of his $50,000 in savings, plus a second mortgage on the small house he had bought for his mother in the 3rd Ward. Dorothy watched her son work 18-hour days, writing code, cold calling potential clients, and personally installing security systems. Many nights she would find him asleep at his computer, still wearing his suit from client meetings. The early rejections were brutal and often tinged with skepticism that a young black man could provide sophisticated cybersecurity solutions. "We appreciate your time, but we'll go with a more established firm," became a familiar refrain. Marcus learned to have white colleagues make initial client calls, then appear as the technical expert once meetings were scheduled. His persistence paid off when Chevron agreed to a pilot program after a series of cyber attacks had compromised several energy companies. Marcus's system not only prevented future breaches, but identified ongoing threats that Chevron's existing security had missed. The success led to a 5-year contract worth $10 million and referrals to other major corporations. By 2010, Washington Tech Solutions employed 200 people and had secured contracts with over 50 Fortune 500 companies. Marcus never forgot his roots, establishing scholarship funds for students from underprivileged backgrounds and refusing to relocate his headquarters from Houston's historically black neighborhoods, despite pressure from investors to move to more prestigious areas. The company's valuation reached $1 billion in 2018, making Marcus one of the youngest black billionaires in America. Forbes featured him on their cover with the headline, "The Quiet Revolutionary," highlighting his contributions to cybersecurity and philanthropy. He had donated over $100 million to educational causes and established a technology training center in the 3rd Ward, providing free programming courses to unemployed residents. Despite his wealth, Marcus remained remarkably grounded. He still lived in Houston, drove a modest Tesla, and flew commercial rather than owning a private jet. His regular route between Houston and Los Angeles was for business meetings with entertainment industry clients who needed security for their digital assets. Jennifer Chen, his executive assistant for 8 years, had booked this particular flight as part of Marcus's routine visit to discuss a cybersecurity contract with Disney Studios. The $50 million deal would protect intellectual property for upcoming film releases, and Marcus had spent weeks preparing his presentation. As he sat in seat 2A, reviewing contract details on his laptop, Marcus had no idea that his success story was about to collide with the harsh reality of racial profiling. The man who had built a billion-dollar empire from nothing, who employed thousands and had donated millions to charity, was about to be judged solely by the color of his skin. The passengers questioning his presence didn't know they were looking at someone who had likely contributed more to their city's economy than they ever would. They saw only what their prejudices allowed them to see, setting in motion a chain of events that would expose the ugly underbelly of assumption and bias that still plagued American society in 2024. The atmosphere inside the Boeing 777 grew increasingly tense as David Sullivan's complaints gained momentum. What started as whispered comments had evolved into a full-scale passenger revolt, with several economy-class travelers now openly questioning Marcus Washington's right to occupy his first-class seater. Flight attendant Jessica Rodriguez found herself caught between her professional training and a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond normal protocols. At p.m., 15 minutes before scheduled departure, Captain Robert Hayes made the decision that would forever alter the trajectory of everyone aboard UA 1847. After consulting with ground security via radio, he authorized what the airline would later classify as a precautionary passenger verification, corporate speak for what was, in reality, racially motivated harassment. Marcus first became aware of the commotion when he noticed passengers turning to stare at him. The murmur of voices had grown loud enough to penetrate his concentration, and he removed his noise-canceling headphones to hear David Sullivan's voice carrying from row 23. "I'm telling you, something's not right," Sullivan was saying to anyone who would listen. "I've been flying for 30 years and that guy just doesn't belong up there. Look at his clothes, look at how he's acting. Real first-class passengers don't dress like that." Marcus glanced down at his attire: dark jeans, a black polo shirt, and comfortable sneakers. It was his standard travel outfit for cross-country flights, chosen for comfort rather than formality. He had learned long ago that trying to dress to meet others' expectations was a futile exercise, but now he wondered if his casual appearance was being weaponized against him. Two airport security officers, James Thompson and Maria Santos, boarded the aircraft at p.m. Thompson, a former police officer with 12 years of airport security experience, had responded to hundreds of passenger disputes, but this one felt different from the moment he stepped onto the plane. The tension was palpable, and he could see that the passengers were divided into factions, some supporting Sullivan's position, others looking uncomfortable with the proceedings. "Sir, we need to see your identification and boarding pass," Thompson said as he approached Marcus's seat, his hand resting casually on his radio. His tone was professional but carried an undertone of suspicion that wasn't lost on the surrounding passengers. Marcus felt his pulse quicken, but his voice remained calm and measured. "Of course, officer. Is there a problem?" As Marcus reached for his wallet, he was acutely aware that every passenger in first class was watching his movements. The businessman in 1A had stopped his phone call. The elderly woman in 3B was peering over her reading glasses. Even the flight attendants had paused their pre-flight preparations to observe the interaction. "We've received reports of a passenger possibly being in the wrong seat," Santos explained, examining Marcus's identification with unnecessary scrutiny. His driver's license clearly showed his name, address in Houston's River Oaks neighborhood, one of the city's most exclusive areas, and the photo matched perfectly. "This is my seat," Marcus replied, handing over his boarding pass. "I'm a global services member and I fly this route regularly." Thompson radioed ground control to run Marcus's information through the airline system. The response came back. Within 30 seconds, Marcus Washington confirmed first-class passenger, global services status, no security flags, frequent flyer with over 100,000 miles annually. Despite the clear verification, Thompson seemed reluctant to end the encounter. The pressure from the passengers behind him was mounting, with Sullivan now standing in the aisle demanding action. "See, I told you something was fishy," Sullivan declared loudly. "They need to check if he really bought that ticket or if someone else did. These kinds of people sometimes use stolen credit cards." The racist implication hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several passengers gasped audibly, while others nodded in agreement. Marcus felt the familiar surge of anger that he had learned to control over decades of similar encounters, but this time was different. This time he was trapped in a metal tube at 30,000 feet, with no escape route. "Excuse me?" said Patricia Morris, a middle-aged black woman from Seat 4C who worked as a federal judge in Los Angeles. "I've been listening to this nonsense for 10 minutes and I'm appalled. This gentleman has shown you his identification and boarding pass. What exactly is the problem here?" Her intervention created a new dynamic in the cabin. Other passengers began choosing sides, with a heated argument erupting between different sections of the plane. The situation had evolved from a simple verification into a full-scale confrontation about race, class, and belonging in America. Captain Hayes, monitoring the situation from the cockpit, realized that the conflict was beyond what his crew could handle in the air. The decision to involve airport security had backfired spectacularly, turning a routine flight into a powder keg of social tensions. At p.m., 5 minutes after the scheduled departure time, Hayes made an announcement that stunned everyone aboard. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to an ongoing security situation, we will be returning to the gate for additional screening procedures. Please remain seated while we work to resolve this matter." The announcement sent shockwaves through the cabin. Marcus sat in disbelief as he realized that an entire flight, 187 passengers, was being delayed because of complaints about his presence in first class. The businessman in 1A was frantically rebooking meetings on his phone. A family traveling to their daughter's wedding began to panic about missing the ceremony. "This is ridiculous," shouted Karen Williams, a nurse from seat 14D. "We're all going to miss our connections because some people can't handle seeing a black man in first class." Her comment sparked another round of arguments, with passengers defending and attacking both Marcus and the complainants. Flight attendants struggled to maintain order as voices rose and tempers flared throughout the cabin. Security Officer Santos attempted to de-escalate the situation by asking Marcus to voluntarily move to an economy seat just for this flight, promising that the airline would provide compensation. The suggestion was met with immediate outrage from Marcus's supporters and cheers from his detractors. "Absolutely not," Marcus replied firmly. "I purchased this seat legitimately. I have every right to occupy it, and I will not be moved because of other people's prejudices." His refusal to comply with the compromise solution sealed the fate of Flight UA 1847. At p.m., Captain Hayes made the decision that would dominate news headlines for weeks to come. The flight was officially canceled, and all passengers would be deplaned for security reasons. The announcement triggered chaos. Passengers began shouting, some at Marcus for causing the situation, others at the complainants for creating the mess in the first place. The divide in the cabin reflected the broader divisions in American society, with people choosing sides based on their own experiences with discrimination and privilege. As passengers gathered their belongings and prepared to deplane, Marcus remained seated, processing the surreal reality that his simple desire to fly home had resulted in the cancellation of an entire commercial flight. He thought about his mother, Dorothy, who had taught him that dignity was something no one could take away. Tonight, his dignity had been assaulted, but his resolve to fight back was stronger than ever. The confrontation in the cabin of UA 1847 had exposed ugly truths about assumptions, prejudice, and the price of standing up to injustice. As passengers filed off the plane in angry clusters, none of them realized that this was just the beginning of a story that would reshape airline policies and spark a national conversation about discrimination in the digital age. The George Bush Intercontinental Airport Terminal erupted into chaos as 187 furious passengers from the canceled UA 1847 crowded around Gate C-28, demanding answers, rebooking, and compensation. The scene resembled a disaster evacuation more than a routine airline delay, with travelers forming angry clusters, children crying, and airport security struggling to maintain order in the face of mounting frustration. Marcus Washington sat quietly in the departure lounge, his laptop bag at his feet, watching the pandemonium unfold around him. His phone had been buzzing incessantly with calls from his assistant Jennifer Chen, who had heard about the flight cancellation and was frantically trying to understand what had happened. He let the calls go to voicemail, not yet ready to explain how his simple business trip had devolved into a public spectacle of racial profiling. United Airlines gate agent Sarah Mitchell, found herself at the center of the storm, facing a crowd of passengers who wanted immediate answers about rebooking, hotel accommodations, and missed connections. Her supervisor, terminal manager Robert Davidson, had been summoned from his office and was attempting damage control, while simultaneously fielding calls from United's corporate headquarters in Chicago. "Ladies and gentlemen, we sincerely apologize for this inconvenience," Davidson announced through a megaphone, his voice barely audible over the crowd noise. "We are working to accommodate all passengers on alternative flights, and we will provide hotel vouchers for those who need overnight accommodations." David Sullivan, the insurance salesman whose complaints had triggered the entire incident, stood near the customer service desk with a small group of supporters, still insisting that his actions had been justified. "All I did was report a suspicious passenger," he told anyone who would listen. "If that man really belonged in first class, why did they cancel the whole flight?" His logic was challenged immediately by Judge Patricia Morris, who had positioned herself as Marcus's unofficial spokesperson. "They canceled the flight because this airline chose to validate racial profiling instead of standing up to it," she replied firmly. "This is exactly the kind of institutional discrimination that civil rights laws were designed to prevent." The confrontation between Sullivan and Morris attracted local news reporters who had been monitoring airport radio frequencies and picked up reports of the unusual flight cancellation. KHOU 11 reporter Amanda Chen arrived at the terminal with a camera crew at PM, followed quickly by representatives from other Houston media outlets. As news cameras began rolling, the story took on a life of its own. Passengers lined up to give interviews, each offering their perspective on what had transpired inside the aircraft. The narrative quickly split along predictable lines, some supporting Sullivan's right to express security concerns, others condemning the entire incident as blatant racism. But it was Marcus's decision to speak publicly that transformed the story from a local news item into a national phenomenon. At PM, he approached Amanda Chen's news crew with the quiet dignity that had characterized his entire career. "My name is Marcus Washington," he said, looking directly into the camera. "I am the CEO and founder of Washington Tech Solutions, a cybersecurity company headquartered here in Houston. Tonight I was removed from a flight I had legitimately purchased, questioned by security, and subjected to racial profiling by fellow passengers who decided I didn't look like I belonged in first class." The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd of onlookers. Passengers who had supported Sullivan's complaints suddenly found themselves face to face with the reality that they had been judging a billionaire entrepreneur, someone whose business success exceeded their own by orders of magnitude. Jennifer Chen, who had been watching the news coverage from her office, immediately began a social media campaign to support her boss. She posted photos of Marcus receiving awards from the Houston Chamber of Commerce, speaking at Rice University commencements, and donating checks to local charities. Within hours, the hashtag was trending nationally, with Marcus's story shared millions of times across social platforms. The corporate response was swift and devastating for United Airlines. By PM, the story had been picked up by national news networks, with CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC all leading with coverage of the incident. United's stock price began falling in after-hours trading as investors anticipated the public relations catastrophe that was unfolding. At AM, United Airlines CEO Scott Kirby released a statement apologizing to Marcus Washington and announcing an immediate investigation into the incident. United Airlines does not tolerate discrimination of any kind. The statement read, "We failed Mr. Washington tonight and we are committed to making this right." But the damage was already spreading beyond United's corporate offices. Airport security footage obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests filed by civil rights attorneys revealed the extent of the discriminatory treatment Marcus had endured. The videos showed security officers spending 15 minutes verifying information that should have taken 30 seconds to confirm. Dr. Michael Chen, Marcus's former professor at Rice University, appeared on morning news shows to discuss his former student's character and achievements. Marcus Washington is one of the most principled people I've ever known, Dr. Chen told CNN's Anderson Cooper. The idea that he would somehow be unworthy of flying first class is not just wrong, it's insulting to everything America claims to stand for. The story gained additional momentum when other passengers began coming forward with their own accounts of the incident. Flight attendant Jessica Rodriguez, who had served Marcus on previous flights, broke her silence to defend him publicly. "Mr. Washington has always been a courteous professional passenger," she told reporters. "What happened tonight was wrong, and everyone who was involved knows it." Even more damaging to United's position were revelations about the company's history of similar incidents. Civil rights attorneys filed records requests that uncovered a pattern of complaints from minority passengers who claimed they had been subjected to additional scrutiny or removed from flights based on the complaints of white passengers. The legal implications became clear when prominent civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump announced that he would be representing Marcus in a federal discrimination lawsuit against United Airlines. "This case represents everything that's wrong with how Black Americans are treated in spaces where they're not expected to belong," Crump said during a press conference. Mr. Washington's wealth and success couldn't protect him from the same prejudices that affect every Black person in America. Corporate sponsors began distancing themselves from United Airlines as the story dominated news cycles. Several major companies canceled advertising campaigns, and the airline industry as a whole faced scrutiny about their policies regarding passenger complaints and security procedures. The incident also sparked a broader conversation about discrimination in the travel industry. Other airlines rushed to review their own policies and training procedures, hoping to avoid similar public relations disasters. The Department of Transportation announced an investigation into airline practices regarding passenger complaints and civil rights protections. For Marcus, the revelation that his story had resonated with millions of people was both gratifying and exhausting. His phone rang constantly with interview requests, speaking opportunities, and messages of support from around the world. But beneath the public attention was a deeper realization about the persistence of racial discrimination in American society. He sat in his Houston office the morning after the incident, watching news coverage of the story that had made him internationally famous overnight. Marcus reflected on his mother Dorothy's words about education being a ticket out of poverty. He had achieved more financial success than she could have ever imagined, but the events on UA 1847 had proven that some barriers remained stubbornly in place. The revelation phase of the story had exposed not just the discrimination Marcus faced, but the systemic nature of prejudice that continued to affect African Americans, regardless of their achievements or social status. The question now was whether the national attention would lead to meaningful change or simply fade into the next news cycle. 6 months after the UA 1847 incident, the steps of the federal courthouse in Houston were packed with reporters, civil rights activists, and supporters as Marcus Washington emerged from what would become a landmark civil rights settlement. The legal battle that followed that fateful evening in March had exposed not just individual prejudice, but systemic discrimination that reached the highest levels of corporate America. The lawsuit filed by civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump had evolved far beyond a simple discrimination case. Through extensive discovery, legal teams had uncovered internal United Airlines communications that revealed a troubling pattern of racial profiling incidents that had been covered up or downplayed by corporate leadership. Emails between executives showed discussions about managing complaints from minority passengers differently than those from white customers. "Today's settlement isn't just about money," Marcus said. addressing the crowd from the courthouse steps. It's about accountability, it's about change, and it's about ensuring that no other person has to endure what I experienced on March 15th. The financial terms of the settlement were staggering: $50 million paid to Marcus personally, plus an additional $100 million commitment from United Airlines for comprehensive diversity training, policy reforms, and the establishment of a HIG, Civil Rights Oversight Board. But the monetary compensation was secondary to the systemic changes that the settlement mandated. Under the agreement, United Airlines was required to implement new protocols for handling passenger complaints, including mandatory training for all employees on unconscious bias and discrimination. Any complaint about a passenger's belonging in a particular seat would require supervisory approval and documented justification before any action could be taken. The case had also resulted in criminal charges against David Sullivan, the insurance salesman whose initial complaints had triggered the incident. He was convicted of filing a false police report and sentenced to 200 hours of community service working with organizations focused on racial reconciliation. During his sentencing hearing, Sullivan offered a public apology, admitting that his actions had been motivated by racial prejudice. "I allowed my preconceptions and biases to cloud my judgment," Sullivan said, his voice breaking as he addressed the court. "I caused harm to an innocent man and disrupted the lives of 186 other passengers because I couldn't see past the color of his skin. I will spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for my actions." The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond United Airlines. The Federal Aviation Administration implemented new industry-wide guidelines for handling passenger complaints, requiring airlines to document the specific safety or security concerns that justify removing passengers from flights. The Department of Justice also launched a broader investigation into discrimination in the travel industry. Airport security officers James Thompson and Maria Santos faced professional consequences for their handling of the incident. Both were suspended without pay and required to complete extensive retraining before being allowed to return to duty. Their supervisor was demoted, and new protocols were established requiring supervisory approval for any passenger removal based on third-party complaints. The incident also sparked a cultural reckoning within the airline industry. Major carriers, including American, Delta, and Southwest, proactively reviewed their own policies and procedures, implementing changes designed to prevent similar incidents. The Air Transport Association established a new task force on civil rights in aviation, with Marcus serving as a founding board member. Perhaps most significantly, the case became a catalyst for broader conversations about discrimination in American society. Marcus used his settlement funds to establish the Washington Foundation for Civil Aviation Rights, which provides legal assistance to travelers who experience discrimination and advocates for policy changes at the federal level. Universities across the country began using the UA 1847 case as a teaching tool in business ethics, civil rights law, and conflict resolution courses. The Harvard Business School developed a case study examining the corporate decision-making that led to the incident and the lessons learned from United's response. The media coverage of the case had also elevated Marcus's profile as a social justice advocate. He began speaking regularly at conferences and universities, sharing his story and advocating for continued progress on civil rights issues. His company, Washington Tech Solutions, became a model for corporate diversity and inclusion, with other businesses seeking guidance on creating more equitable workplaces. 1 year after the incident, Marcus returned to Gate C-28 at George Bush Intercontinental Airport for the first time since that traumatic evening. He was accompanied by Judge Patricia Morris, who had become a close friend and ally, and several other passengers who had supported him during the original incident. The gate area had been renamed the Civil Rights Corridor by airport authorities, with displays highlighting the history of discrimination in transportation, and the progress made in recent decades. A plaque commemorating the March 15th incident was installed reading, "In memory of the courage required to stand up to injustice and the commitment to ensuring equal treatment for all travelers." United Airlines had also made significant changes beyond those required by the legal settlement. The airline hired its first chief diversity officer, implemented unconscious bias training for all employees, and established a passenger advocate program to ensure that discrimination complaints are handled promptly and fairly. Captain Robert Hayes, who had made the decision to cancel the original flight, became an advocate for civil rights training in the aviation industry. He worked with Marcus and the Washington Foundation to develop educational programs for pilots and crew members, helping them recognize and address discrimination when it occurs. The events of March 15th taught me that neutrality in the face of injustice is complicity, Hayes said during a speech at the National Aviation Association's annual conference. As leaders in this industry, we have a responsibility to ensure that our skies are truly friendly to everyone. The case also had lasting political implications. Several members of Congress cited the UA 1847 incident when introducing legislation to strengthen civil rights protections in transportation. The Passenger Bill of Rights Act, passed in 2025, includes specific provisions prohibiting discrimination based on race, ethnicity, religion, or appearance. For Marcus personally, the experience had been both traumatic and transformative. While he continued to lead Washington Tech Solutions, he increasingly focused on his advocacy work, using his platform to highlight ongoing discrimination and push for systemic change. That night on UA 1847 could have broken me, Marcus reflected during an interview on the one-year anniversary of the incident. Instead, it revealed the strength I never knew I had, and the support of millions of people who believe in justice and equality. We still have work to do, but we've proven that change is possible when people stand up and demand better. The story of Marcus Washington and UA 1847 became more than just a discrimination case. It became a symbol of resilience, justice, and the ongoing struggle for civil rights in America. The incident that began with unconscious bias and escalated to national outrage ultimately resulted in meaningful change that continues to protect travelers and promote equality in the skies. Today, when passengers board flights across America, they benefit from policies and protections that exist because one man refused to accept discrimination and an entire nation demanded justice. The empty seat in first class that sparked so much controversy had been filled with hope, accountability, and the promise of a more equitable future for all travelers.